This video is inspired by Moxie Watt's series of the same title, linked in the description. Here at Drakenwild, we are scholars. We follow the evidence wherever it may lead us and note down even the most minute of details. With eyes unclouded, we find fresh perspectives to look at and enjoy the Zelda series. If you love Zelda lore, you can subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. It would really help out. Alright, back to it. Gerudo are a parasitic species. It is not a theory, it's a statement of fact. I am of course speaking from the perspective of science, biology, specifically biology. There of course is such a thing as a societal parasite, but that is not what we will be discussing. For now! This video will be divided into two main parts. First, we will discuss Gerudo biology based on their in-game appearances. Then, we will look at the meaning of that biology for Gerudo Culture and the rest of Hyrule, based on both what is actually shown within the game and pure speculation on my part. So, what is a parasite? In the simplest terms, a parasitic organism is one that depends on other organisms for survival, while not providing anything in return and often to the detriment of the other organism. At first glance, Gerudo don't seem to fit this definition at all. Like, look at them. Does this strong and independent hot woman look like she needs anyone's help to get by? No, of course not. She's easily capable of fending for herself. So why would I say such an offensive thing? Gerudo parasitic? Why never? Well, it's just not that simple. The important part to understand here is what survival means in the context of biology. It can mean the survival of an individual, of course, but it could also mean the survival of the species. And herein lies the core of the issue. You know what is the most basic thing a species needs to survive? It's the ability to reproduce. And what do Gerudo lack? The ability to reproduce by themselves. This makes them parasitic. They require assistance of other humanoids in order to secure their continued survival. On a societal level, they don't provide those humanoids with anything in return, and an argument could be made that, if anything, they are actively hurting those societies with their activity. That's not all! There's much more that can be deduced, even just from the way they look. Our earlier classification can be specified. Gerudo are parasitic mimics. This tells us a lot about how this race evolved and how it fits within Hyrule. Let me explain. This is a Gerudo. This is a Hylian. And this is a Sheikah. Mimicry is a visual resemblance between two different species. It can serve a few different functions, but in case of parasitic mimicry, it provides the parasite with an advantage and helps it achieve its goal. For worms, it may be getting eaten. For cuckoos, it's scaring smaller birds away from their nest. And for Gerudo, it's getting laid. From this, we can deduce that mates Gerudo will usually look for are either Hylian or Sheikah, as these are the only two races with the body type that matches Gerudo women. It also explains why absolutely all of Gerudo come across as hot to Hylians, some of whom are desperate enough to pursue these women into the desert. Though we have no proof of this, this is most likely true of Sheikah as well. This means that Gerudo are, quite literally, traps. Yep, that sure was a sentence. A mix between a man of another race and a Gerudo will always result in a Gerudo, never a mixed species child. This is required to ensure a continuous survival of their species. Their biology is brilliantly reflected in Gerudo culture, as well as the makeup of the town, seen in the game. Because Gerudo have to travel to find mates all over the world, their appearance is of course wildly varying in skin tones. Most commonly, they have a slightly darker shade with some variation in hair color, but on the ends of the spectrum are Gerudo with extremely dark or extremely fair skin, both easily found across town. Since no men are allowed inside Gerudo Town, most of the members of the community find the concept of the opposite gender strange and alien. They don't quite know how to approach men, similar to behavior seen in young children. It's so bad, in fact, that before setting out in search of love, they actually undertake legitimate classes on relationships. I'm serious! This is serious! Stop laughing! Leaving the town for an unknown length of time, possibly forever, is of course common. As a result, it is not at all weird to encounter a Gerudo on the road or within many different towns scattered across the map. Notably, despite their presence, there are no examples of relationships of Gerudo with any races other than Hylians, which confirms our earlier suspicions about mimicry and preferred mates. What happens after finding a man seems to widely differ. Given the complete and utter lack of Gerudo minority in towns like Hateno or Lurelin, we can conclude that the vast majority of Gerudo is happy to just have a one-night stand, get pregnant and return home. Some have been known to take their lovers back to the desert, where they would settle near the town, but not in it, as men are not allowed entry even if married to a Gerudo. Finally, some Gerudo may just agree to stay with their husbands within foreign communities. This seems exceedingly rare, however. Culturally, this makes a lot of sense. Gerudo are raised with little to no concept of serious relationships. What they do know is most likely fantasized about and, as a result, pretty far from reality. On top of that, due to their militaristic society and stigma stemming from their connection to Ganon, Gerudo are extremely guarded and distrustful, especially of men. Thus, forming such lasting relationships is made much, much harder. Then it is further disincentivized by the town-wide ban on entry for all males. All Gerudo are well aware that even if they fall in love and marry, they will never be allowed to bring their spouses home, essentially sentencing them to near exile. Then it is no surprise that for most Gerudo, marriage is just not worth the hassle. It is hard to tell what all of that means for queer Gerudo. Game provides no evidence of them even existing, but for the sake of argument, let's assume that they do. Transitioning within Gerudo Town is not possible. The stigma around Ganondorf and male Gerudo in general is just too much for that to happen. Any Gerudo attempting to come out with such a concept would be, in best case scenario, immediately shunned and exiled, and in the worst case, stabbed with spears and scimitars. However, I am not convinced how much of a problem would that be in a society like this. As already discussed, Gerudo are raised with a very poor understanding of gender and men. They barely even have a concept of what it means to be a man, and don't have examples to draw from in their society. Being an all-woman town also means that there is no societal gender divide. For Gerudo, being a very feminine jeweler is equally as natural as packing impressive ups and serving the community as a warrior. Thus, I'd hazard a guess that Gerudo generally wouldn't find it very important to them to be called a Vow instead of Vi. They can fully realize their personality as a Vi after all. Which in turn also means that Gerudo Town is, functionally, a non-binary paradise. As for lesbians or bi Gerudo... Up in the air, to be honest. Their orientation is in no way, shape or form discussed by any of the NPCs, really, and I could see it both ways. Gerudo either wouldn't be accepting of these types of relationships because leaving the town on the journey to get laid is the whole point, and they seem to be very traditional society rooted in hierarchy, or their tradition could just not care whatsoever for what women in town are doing with each other as long as they actually do leave on their journey and come back with children. Perhaps it would be even encouraged to get together for, practice sessions? before going out into the world to find a man. Personally, I'm leaning towards the latter option, because in a single-gender society, it would just make sense that they would be allowed to get together. Though it's your choice what you prefer to believe on this matter. Since now we are firmly in the realm of pure speculation, let's talk about impact Gerudo's way of life has on the rest of Hyrule. Rito, Zora and Gorons most likely have an ambivalent attitude. Traveling Gerudo may bring in some goods, and for sure do bring in rupees. They give business to inns and merchants. They wouldn't be celebrated by any means, but are welcome. Meanwhile, if Sheikah find Gerudo attractive, and they probably do, they don't admit it. They live under very strict rules in a secluded village in the mountains that rarely gets visitors. Gerudo seem to avoid it. Perhaps it's just too out of the way of everything else. Or perhaps they aren't welcome in Kakariko. See, Sheikah have always been closely tied to the royal family of Hyrule. Given that shared history, the Ganondorf problem could have been a source of strong prejudice, even after the passing of many thousands of years. If that was the case, Gerudo would be inclined to avoid entering Kakariko whenever possible. That leaves us with Hylians, the main target of Gerudo's advances. It is reasonable to assume that Hylian perception of Gerudo would be mixed. Gerudo's preference for non-committal relationships stands in stark contrast with the Hylian way of life. This alone is bound to create not-so-nice stereotypes of them in some circles. They would be viewed as heartbreakers, easy women, and so on and so forth. On top of that are the cases of Gerudo taking men back home to the desert. While this does not happen often, it would be enough to induce strong emotional reactions from right-leaning Hylians. There would be claims of Gerudo ruining Hyrule by taking away men from Hylian women looking for husbands. Extremists would make even further leaps, claiming that Gerudo are actively putting Hylian communities in danger by reducing the number of possible defenders in case of a monster attack. That reduction would apply to the workforce as well, resulting in lowering the overall quality of life of citizens, or so they say. Do any of those claims hold water? I don't think so. As already discussed, cases of Gerudo taking Hylians back home are exceedingly rare. Their impact on the economy and defense would most likely lie within the margin of error. That is not to say that all Hylians would be hateful towards Gerudo. For all the vocal reactions of the previously discussed group, many others would simply understand that Gerudo travelers aren't really hurting anyone, even more would just not care, and some would be on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, obsessively loving Gerudo for what they are and fetishizing them. There would also be people, specifically men, who were personally hurt by a Gerudo due to their lack of understanding of how love and relationships work. Miscommunications are bound to happen in a scenario like this, and in some cases they will result in hurt feelings and a feeling of abandonment. With all that considered, can we call Gerudo societal parasites as well as biological ones? Not really, no. At least on the larger scale, they aren't exactly known for abusing other people's goodness of heart and hospitality. There could be individuals acting like this, of course, but as a whole, no. In order to stay close to the heavens, sacrifices must be made, especially if you also want to be a humanoid with opposable thumbs. Rito hands, at least on the first glance, are weirdly cartoony for a setting that, although stylized, remains pretty realistic. But what if I told you that bird people anatomy makes perfect sense and is echoed by the Rito way of living? I'm Drakenwild, and this is Rito Biology. Okay, so first order of business. Feathers do not behave like this. They lack joints and muscles and all that jazz. Of course, we can assume cartoon logic, but then this whole video would be pointless, and I'm not about to let this happen. Besides, it's more fun that way. So, anyway, these are not feathers, these are fingers. Very thin, long, bat-like fingers, covered in vein like any regular feather shaft and thus able to generate lift. If you look at the Rito wing up close, in very specific lighting, you will notice that light refracts differently on their hands than the rest of the wing, clearly marking, well, fingers. Everything around and further up the forearm are regular, genuine feathers though, creating a surface for flying, most of it concentrating up to the elbow. Past the elbow, on the arm, feathers are still present, though the surface they create is much smaller, almost non-existent. That is most likely an evolutionary adjustment. Since their wings are doubling as hands, feathers on their arms would constantly get caught on their body and break. Their absence saves the energy needed to constantly regrow them. Adjustment like that has severe consequences, however. Their wing surface is reduced, eyeballing it by over half of what it could have been if they just had a dedicated wing like regular birds do. This means Rito actually aren't well suited for flight. Their wings simply can't generate enough lift force for them to ascend. Instead, what they actually do is glide. They jump from higher points and catch updrafts in order to stay in the air, quite similarly to what large birds of prey do, though they do it to conserve energy rather than out of necessity. But hey, at least they have hands! Yay! Becomes way less exciting when you stop for a moment to consider what living with a giant long-fingered and hollow-boned hand like that would look like, because, yeah, Rito bones are most certainly hollow to reduce body mass and keep them from plummeting down to the ground whenever they try to glide. And then, on top of all that, is one more issue. Rito clearly evolved as meat-eaters. Most of them sport sharp, hooked beaks and strong talons for hunting prey from the air. This is all well and good, until it isn't. In order to see their targets clearly from high up in the air, Rito evolved an eagle-like sense of sight. It is unparalleled across all other races of Hyrule. However, as is the case with pretty much everything related to Rito's flight, it came at a price. Rito eyesight is the best there is, yes, during the day. At night, they might as well be blind. Pale light of the moon and stars is not enough for them to illuminate their surroundings. The impact all these evolutionary adjustments had on the Rito way of living cannot be overstated. It is felt throughout all spheres of living, cascading down from architecture through things like warfare and academia, all the way to foreign relations. It's part of Rito's very being. It's inescapable. So, without further ado, let's explore it. The sacrificial nature of Rito's flight nowhere is as apparent as in their architectural choices. It seems stupid. Why on earth would buildings, static and tied to the ground, the literal antithesis of flying, be even remotely related? Doesn't make any sense. Or does it? Flight is often seen as the most freeing power one can have. It allows you to go anywhere you'd like. In the case of Rito, however, it also strips them of the freedom to settle wherever they please. Quite on the contrary, Their selection of possible locations is severely limited, and with that come limitations to architectural styles they can employ. Rito need to live high up. Because they can't ascend by themselves, they need to be able to leap in order to fly. Presence of local updrafts is also strongly preferred, as is the accessibility on foot in case of a storm or some other emergency. These requirements already narrow down the options to nothing but mountains, and not even all of them. But it doesn't end there, oh no! Because of their fragile bones, Rito can't work with large hammers to carve into rock, or cut trees, or build in general, so they need help, land-based help, and a way to ferry in the materials. Thus, the pool of possibilities shrinks even more. Rito village is located in a very peculiar place. Surrounded by sheer cliffs on all sides, it clings to a ginormous rock spire, rising above a lake. Naturally occurring, strong updrafts are common in the vicinity. It's tall, it's windy, but also not remote. Nearby terrain is rough, but not impassable, and the immediate area around the lake is actually pretty flat and rich in timber. It is one of the very few places in Hyrule which fit so neatly into the needs of the Rito. Settling here was an easy, albeit consequence-heavy choice. The main objective was achieved. The village is vertical, attached to a single path, spiraling upwards around a central rock, for a total of 3 floors. All of that is very takeoff friendly. Both large and tiny landings are strewn about all across the spiral, planks outstretched into the vast sky and land below, just asking the Rito to make the leap. However, in order to accommodate the Rito glide to such an extent, something else had to suffer, and in this case, it was the housing. All of the buildings are located on the outside edge of the path, attached to it on floor level, but otherwise unsupported from the bottom. Well, in majority of the cases anyway. Where there was a possibility to do so, houses were sat on a rock perch. For most of the structures, however, such building conveniences were absent. So instead, builders of the village decided to hang the houses up on giant chains, securely attaching them to rock structures overhead, as if the whole buildings were not but ginormous lanterns. This hanging city concept turns Rito village into the most unique settlement in all of Hyrule, but also the most precarious one. Subjected to the whims of the winds, the whole village creaks and moves ever so slightly. Only the highly specialized architecture stops the lantern houses from being torn away from the central pathway and thrown violently on their chains by the first strong storm. Rito houses are open on all sides. You'd think this is because of convenience. That way, Rito can just freely fly inside, except wouldn't a specialized landing on the outermost side be enough to satiate the need of unobstructed access from the air? It would. Of course it would. The wall cover from cold winds, snow and rain wasn't sacrificed just for convenience of access. That'd be asinine. No, it was a crucial part of the architectural design of the village. In order for it to survive strong winds, the surface of buildings had to be reduced to the absolute minimum, allowing all the forceful blows to push through rather than strain the wooden bridges to the point of snapping. In exchange, Rito gave up the comfort of cover. They don't heat their houses, there's no point. They can't keep any warmth inside. Instead, they got used to the cold, relying on their feathers and clothing to avoid freezing in the unforgiving climate of Tabantha. Frankly, the inhabitants are lucky if it's just the cold winds they have to deal with. Whenever it snows or rains, Rito have only the roofs above their heads to protect them, meaning that at least some of the fall is bound to end up inside their homes. Though, given where the children sleep, Rito don't seem to take much issue with that. They probably don't think about it as anything unusual. Just some days they wake up blanketed by snow. No big deal. Yeah. So, while the Rito village is an incredible sight to behold, it is also a rather harsh environment to live in. It is probably why it doesn't get too many visitors. It is highly unlikely that anyone besides the Rito finds these conditions favorable. That stable next door might be putting the inn out of business soon. And then, on top of everything else, there's the issue of privacy. That is to say, Rito have none. The very design of their village doesn't allow it. In order to reclaim at least some of it, wide, curtain-like strips of cloth are placed over a critical part of the window, loosely covering one of the sides, but only one, and most commonly, specifically that which faces downward direction of the main artery. Given that placement, Rito seem to care more about protecting themselves from the looks of outsiders, so coming in from the bottom, rather than their fellow Rito. I suppose it makes sense when their buildings are forced to be open at all times anyway. Actually, I do wonder, do they get hard cases of snooping neighbors? Like, stereotypically, it'd be grandmas, but Rito don't have those. Bird Karens then? I mean, Rito in general seem like a gossipy type. There must be some etiquette in place, huh? Look at that village surveilling itself. Jeez, this might be worse than getting snowed on in your sleep. Anyway, having buildings be see-through at all times is not the end of concessions that needed to be made in order for the hanging city concept to work, although it is the most severe one. Other things include choice of materials and size of the huts. Rito village isn't wooden just because it was convenient in this region. It's also due to limitations of metal anchors and the rock itself. If the houses were too heavy, one of these two things would snap, and it doesn't really matter which. Result would be the same. So, wood was chosen as the primary material because it's lighter than the alternatives, and the size was reduced to a single and fairly small chamber only, to keep that weight limit in check. As a result, the huts aren't just cold and non-private, they're also tiny and extremely flammable. On one hand, Rito are covered in even more flammable feathers, so it checks out. On the other, remember how I said they can't see at night? Rito lanterns only give off a dim glow, by far not enough for the residents to safely leave home at night. Fire-based sources of light probably could rectify that situation, but alas. It's a real problem, by the way, the lanterns. It sounds like nothing but mild inconvenience, until you consider that they are living in a world overrun by monsters, with an active terrorist group on the prowl, in a village guarded by people who wouldn't be able to see intruders half the time they're on duty. Night Watch is mostly for show, is what I'm saying. Aside from that lovely issue, this twofold fire problem affects one more area of Rito life: cooking. They obviously can't do it from their own homes. They lack the space for it, for one, and even then, the wooden floor absolutely would catch fire. Not to mention the safety hazard this would be to anyone in the room, including the person doing the cooking. Those nice tails look like they would very easily find their way underneath the pot into the flames. This was a genuine issue, which Rito solved in a way that's both smart and kinda funny. They made a kitchen house that has a kitchen. It sits on a rock column, allowing it to have a cobblestone floor. It has a little chimney, it has kitchen supplies on the sides, and a pot with a fire right damn smack in the middle. That fire honestly looks like a prisoner in a high security cell. It is kept as far away from any wooden elements as physically possible to prevent any random sparks from setting the entire building ablaze. It has a literal cage around it, preventing Rito feathers from getting inside, and it is kept in total and complete isolation. Because, yes, nobody lives in that house. It's just a pot and a fire. As far as I can tell, this kitchen is used as a communal one, on an as-needed basis. Everyone can access it if they so desire, kind of like visitation for the fire inmate. I'm gonna stop now. Let me go back to the no walls thing for a second though, because it is a curse that keeps on cursing. Rito are smart, very much so. Their solution to the cooking problem is very creative, and so are designs of their bows. Falcon bows are among the best in the whole of Hyrule. They employ sights, stabilizers, and drawing aids, masked nicely by decorative pieces at the tip. All unheard of across all but one other bow in the land, and that one, the ancient bow, was made by a genuine ancient technology specialist and specifically engineered to be the best bow that technology has to offer. It's a darn shame then that Rito don't have their own scientists. Like, at all. None. That sad state of affairs has nothing to do with Rito's own willingness to learn, and has everything to do with paper. Engaging in sciences requires paper, and lots of it. Books, notebooks for research, records, you name it. You need it all to raise a population of scientists. However, in Rito village, paper seems to be a rarer commodity, and as such is used sparingly. Because, as it turns out, being the very opposite of waterproof is a critical weakness for any material in a building that looks like this. It's the storage that's the main problem. Rito quite literally have no place consistently dry enough to keep large quantities of fresh paper, books, and ledgers safe. They can sneak in a book in a cupboard here and there, but that's about it. Instead, for their day-to-day writing needs, they use wooden slabs. They come waterproof, in which they carve symbols and then bind them together. You can see these all over the village, stored on shelves in most houses. Thing is, these booklets are obviously hard to write in, and even when you do, they don't contain that much information due to the thickness of each page. Thus, they are only used for recording information that is immediately necessary and not much of it. So, what do they do for science, history, and all that jazz? Well, simple. Oral tradition. Everything is passed down through generations. Son of a shopkeeper is expected to run a shop. Son of a bowmaker is expected to craft bows, children of a bard become singers themselves, and the eldest member of the village is expected to learn history from ballads and tall tales of the current elder. Generally, elder and bards are main sources Rito have on events from before their lifetime. As expected, their knowledge of history is very poor as a result. Even when it's something as important and as recent as a great goddamn calamity from 100 years prior, their knowledge is very limited. They have only the faintest of ideas about what meadow is, despite it circling right above their heads. They only remember one of the champions, Revali, and even then, their idea of him is skewed and exaggerated. Granted, oral tradition only really works for history and crafts, not for science. Hence, no Rito scientists. They're sure as hell are Rito warriors though, and lots of them. Their glide, which they sacrificed so much for, combined with their fantastic long-ranged bows, gives them an edge over most opponents. Sounds like a perfect recipe for combat supremacy. Well, for as long as they can stay airborne, at least. If they are ever forced to land mid-encounter and defend themselves on the ground, however, oh boy, they cut holes in their swords! Holes in the swords! And spears too! Rito did that to reduce the weight of the blade, so that it doesn't overburden them during the glide. A hole like that, however, has consequences. It's a theme with the Rito if you haven't noticed. In order to achieve a severe weight reduction, Rito sacrificed structural integrity of the blade. As a result, their swords are very weak. That's not all there is to it, however. Rito, due to their biology, are at an inherent disadvantage when grounded. Their long, thin fingers, weak and covered in vein, make it hard to get a good grip on a sword handle, and even then, their hollow bones are prone to break on impact. Rito will defend themselves on land if they have to, but they are laughably bad at it. Makes their guard outpost at the edge of town even more of a joke than it already was. Even just in general, grabbing Hylian-sized items with Rito's giant hands must be awkward, and vein makes it hard to get a proper hold on things due to reduced friction. Because Rito's fingers are so long and thin, they only have the minimal amount of muscle necessary for movement, making their grip rather weak. And then, again, there are the bones. The brittle bones. Because of all this, available lines of work are pretty limited for the Rito. They can't engage in anything that involves large impact tools. Thus, mining and woodcutting are totally off limits, lest their fragile bones would break. And menial labor, like carrying heavy packages for instance, is not the best of ideas due to the weakness of Rito's grip. There are no smiths in Rito village. That'd be extremely dangerous to the smith and the village as a whole, because, as discussed prior, fire hazard. There are no architects, because that would require the frequent use of paper. Rito are not prepared to use paper. There are no builders, because, again, fragile bones, weak grip. So that leaves us with just a handful of options. Hunters, gatherers, scouts, guards, warriors, traders, singers, and craftsmen. Rito excel at some, do just fine with the others. I'm looking at those guards, by the way, in case you were wondering. This list doesn't even begin to cover the needs of a whole village, however. For that, Rito more than likely rely on outside help. contractors, if you will. It's probably precisely why there is a stable located right by the village gate and dealing in local timber no less. Also, why the village is so gosh darn nice and accessible on all levels to folk who can't fly. All that is to say, Rito clearly have a good and long-lasting relationship with the Hylians. I'd go as far as to say that Hylians were very important to the creation of Rito village itself. As we just discussed, Rito aren't really builders and architects. They had to have received help with creating their town. All the metal parts, especially chains, had to have been imported from somewhere. Goron City, perhaps? The wood had to be cut and moved, all that. I don't think Rito sat idly by while someone else took care of the process, but I do think that they mostly played the role of supporters, carrying light cargo around, helping to establish bridges and scaffoldings, advising through design, things like that. After the construction was done, the good relationship remained. Hylians settled by the Rito village gate, participating in trade with the village and serving as a main trading hub, connecting it with the rest of Hyrule. It was also allowed to manage and benefit from wood production, perhaps as thanks for the help with the village's creation. Other than that though, Rito don't seem to have strong bonds with other races. Like, at all. Village is located in the coldest and very remote corner of Hyrule and pretty unwelcoming by design. No Zora, Gerudo or Gorons frequent the region. Frankly, it might be outright too frigid for all of them. Rito don't seem to mind though. They can handle all of their needs through the stable. If there is any communication between the Elder and other leaders, it is probably handled either by stable Hylians or by Rito messengers. I kinda doubt there is though. After Calamity, Hyrule became fractured and this state of things has become the accepted norm for the Rito. They live a simple life and don't have much care for Hyrule-wide politics, not that there are any at the moment. They just mostly want to be left in peace and allowed to fly. I think that the only link other races have to Rito are random Rito travelers seen wandering the land, Cass being the most prominent one. They aren't diplomatic envoys though, just tourists, I guess. And not very common either. Leaving Tabantha for more flatlands riddled by monsters is pretty dangerous when you can't ascend on your own, after all. I mean, Tabantha itself isn't exactly a safe haven either. It just gives the Rito more opportunities to get back up and in the air than most other regions do. Same goes for Hybra. Those areas are commonly frequented by the Rito. The warriors patrol the village's territory, the hunters go in search of prey, gatherers bring back materials. It all works great until it doesn't. The mortality rate of adult Rito is rather high. It seems that the vast majority of them, both men and women, don't live long enough to become elderly. We've only ever seen one Rito of venerable age, and he's the Elder. Just from that name alone, we can gather that elderly Rito are a thing of extreme rarity, and thus widely respected. My guess is that Rito, being the strong-headed, proud types they are, might have a tendency to get themselves in potentially dangerous situations, which, together with fragile bones, doesn't create the best combinations. Flying incidents are also likely to be contributing factors. It's worth remembering that while Rito did indeed evolve to glide, they aren't in fact immune to gravity, and so anything going wrong while in the air can lead to a lethal accident. All of these add up, making it hard for the Rito to survive their adulthood. Power of flight sounds incredible on paper, but is it worth that though? Lynels are cursed descendants of Zonai. Well, maybe, possibly. There is no concrete proof of this, only loose hints and oddities, entirely open to interpretation. We're in headcanon land now, baby! Lynels are weird as fuck. When compared to the rest of the enemy roster, they stand out not just because of their sheer power and speed, but also due to unusual behavior, equipment and intelligence. Let's tackle these one by one. Lynels are well known for their bestial strength and ferocity. However, an oft overlooked trait of theirs is just how non-aggressive they actually are. Any other monster, be it something as large as a moblin or as small as a keys, will attack travelers on sight. Just breathing in the wrong neighborhood is provocation enough for them. Lynels stand in contrast so stark that they seem reluctant to fight by comparison. When approached by an intruder, instead of immediately attacking, they engage in a staring contest, attempting to ward off the threat by intimidation alone. They give anyone ample time to turn tail and run. Only if that seems to fail do they draw their weapons and fight, meaning that simply respecting Lynels' personal space can easily get you out of trouble when running into one. You needn't search for long to find a practical proof of this non-aggression. As it happens, the Botw Bridge stable is located in the direct neighborhood of a Lynel territory. Separated by nothing more but a puny rock, this fearsome monster spends its days right behind this bustling communication center. And yet, the stable functions without issue, and the trail is frequented, seemingly with no interference from the beast. Lynel is left alone, and in turn, it leaves others in peace. An arrangement like that simply would not work with any other of Ganon's monsters. Look no further than Hylian's stable. When rider bokoblins set up camp nearby, they caused quite a disruption, pestering travelers on trail and interfering with stable's communication with the rest of the network. They were so annoying that the staff had no choice but to look for a warrior capable enough to get rid of them for good. That is not all. Another weird thing is that, at least as far as I'm aware, Lynels never eat and never sleep. The only thing they are seen doing is patrolling a small patch of land they call home and roaring. This, again, is quite different from other common monsters who display a range of different behaviors, eating, sleeping, hunting and socializing among them. Lynels don't do any of that, even if in close proximity to another Lynel like the three found in North Tabantha Snowfield. I'd say that maybe they sleep standing up or something, if not for the fact that they barely ever stop their patrol for more than but a moment. They don't hunt either. Animals can simply pass or even stop nearby and be completely safe. Lynels don't seem to pay any attention to them at all. The only thing they do in breaks from patrolling their tiny domain is roaring. Here, I'd like to stop and pose a question. Why do the Lynels roar? A vocalization like that would usually imply a challenge or a threat, but to whom? Majority of Lynels live in remote locations, far away from places where one would reasonably expect to find travelers. In most cases, with few notable exceptions, they don't even live near other monsters or their own kind. As far as anyone is concerned, they are completely alone. And yet, they roar. So perhaps this isn't a threat, but a cry. A profound scream, a lament. They stare at the sky and let out their pain, never hearing a response, nor from gods, nor from their own kin. They are suffering alone, forever. What do they lament then? Their loneliness? Perhaps? Or, perhaps, they cry for something they once had and now was lost. Maybe they weren't always the monsters we know them as now. A curse would explain their reluctance to fight, the desire to be alone unseen, and their strange minimal daily routine. Put a pin in that, by the way. We'll come back to it later. For now, let's stay on task. Weapons used by Lynels stand out between arms wielded by other monsters too, while bokoblins and moblins rely on clubs and spears haphazardly put together from wood and bone, as well as weapons of Hylian origin, which they managed to steal off of travelers. Lynel equipment is very, shall we say, sophisticated. These aren't any ordinary pieces of scrap metal held together by string and leather. These are complex designs, put together with purpose. Equipment like that couldn't have been made out in the wide open field. That must have been created in a forge. But where is that forge? Clearly, none of the contemporary races would make such a thing. These weapons don't match any of the modern styles used across Hyrule, not even the designs of Sheikah. The ability of Lynel shields to deal damage is entirely unique as well. There isn't anyone who, willingly or not, could have supplied Lynels with such an arsenal. We can conclude then that it is simply not possible for these weapons to have been stolen, like the swords wielded by bokoblins. Then it must mean that the Lynel equipment was made by Lynels themselves. I mean, well, duh. In other words, Lynels made themselves pretty complex equipment in forges which don't exist anymore. How old are these swords exactly? And damn! That's some seriously durable weaponry. Like, yes, when Link picks up a quote-unquote fresh Lynel weapon, it doesn't last all that long. Consider, however, that it was kept in a really bad conditions, always outside, be it sun or rain, for what was probably centuries, and it is still holding up really well in spite of that. This really speaks volumes about the sheer quality of these things. Also, that means that all this time we've been beating monsters around with what are essentially priceless ancient artifacts. Enjoy that thought. Furthermore, creation of weapons like that would obviously require a lot of skill and some level of teamwork. Persons skilled enough to make such excellent arms wouldn't also be responsible for actually mining the metal they were made of, you know? In turn, that would mean Lynels used to have an actual honest-to-God society, civilization, probably culture too. Being reduced to endlessly strolling around a tiny patch of land, well, no wonder they want to scream. There is just one more thing I find interesting about Lynel equipment. These weapons deal a lot of damage, and I mean a lot. Coincidentally, this makes them go really well together with the Barbarian armor set, which grants an attack boost. And as you are all probably well aware, the Barbarian armor set has been all but confirmed to be Zonai in origin. Funny things, coincidences? Except, what's that? The savage, brutal aesthetic of Lynel weapons matches up quite well with bone and leather of Barbarian equipment, despite being entirely made out of metal. Almost like these sets were made for each other. It is also worth noting that the only case of non-Lynel shield-based damage we've ever seen was a shield-mounted flamethrower in the shape of a Zonai dragon head. Boy, do I like coincidences! Especially the ones that support my random trains of thought. Ha! One last trait that separates Lynels from other monsters is their intelligence. We don't exactly have too many vectors of comparison, seeing how reluctant Lynels are to interact with their environment, but we'll do our best with what is there. Firstly, Kilton's disguises. Be it Bokoblin, Moblin or Lysol, Link can fool them all with nothing but a mask and a bit of, frankly, quite impressive acting. Lynels though? Hell no! They can see right through this crap. It is unclear though at which point do they realize they are looking at a tiny Hylian in a giant mask on the head, rather than one of their own kind. Does it click with the Lynels seconds before they attack? Or are they staring at us in amusement, while we waltz and parade ourselves around them? Honestly, hard to tell. Not the most expressive types, these guys. Another, more subtle sign of higher intelligence of Lynels is their ability to adjust their strategy to the situation they find themselves in, as well as the sheer precision of their attacks. Unlike other monsters, they carry both melee and ranged weapons, so that they never find themselves at a disadvantage in combat. They can freely switch between bow and whatever else they have, to adjust to the range at which the threat positions themselves. And make no mistake, their far-ranged shots absolutely are highly difficult trick shots. This shit takes serious skills and training, okay? Especially in order to execute these shots in such a rapid succession, all highly precise. A bokoblin looks like you gave a bow to a monkey by comparison, often missing even at a close distance. Frankly, Lynel's unparalleled ability to effectively use their arsenal in a variety of situations puts them leagues above many of Hyrule's trained soldiers. No low intelligence creature would achieve this level of ability. It's almost as if, in the distant past, Lynels used to be some sort of a savage, warlike tribe. If they were indeed cursed, their skills could have transferred over, along with the weapons they wield. I've said before that Lynels, being members of a race, cursed into living as monsters, would explain all of the oddities in their behavior. Let's just assume that the curse is real and dig into it for a bit. Lynels used to be a civilization. After some unknown catastrophic event, they were all suddenly turned into monsters, subservient to a higher power. In one fell swoop, they lost everything. Their lives as they knew them, their civilization, their freedom, even their ability to speak. Hell, being transformed into a monster against one's own will is straight up body horror. They became terrifying, ugly. So naturally, they scattered. Some would try to stay in groups and, in a mix of denial and bouts of anger, attempt to fight their fate, which seems to have ultimately failed. Others would give in and serve their new master, trying to bargain for their freedom. The rest left Faron and ran to the far reaches of Hyrule, not wanting to stay in the place that used to be their home, turned into a painful reminder of what have been. Eventually, running Lynels would settle in various corners of the land, depressed and prone to lashing out. Their grief and trauma has caused them to shut in. Nothing had a point anymore, everything became worthless. This was not a state they wanted to be seen in, so the majority made sure to isolate themselves. As time has passed, more and more would lose all hope and attempt to end their suffering, only to discover that, under the influence of Ganon, even this act of desperate defiance was an impossibility. That realization turned Lynels lethargic. Time has lost all meaning. They had no agency. They were trapped. They still could feel pain though. So when these two-legged creatures appeared and started encroaching on their enclaves, trying to slay the Lynels, Lynels struck back. They kept striking back. To these new warriors, they were just another monster. Not that Lynels themselves thought any different, that's just how their life was now. Lynels have resigned to their fate. Zonai are described as a savage, warlike tribe, and, as is abundantly clear by now, Lynels fit this description rather well. They are intelligent, possibly on par with other races of Hyrule, and have equipment they shouldn't be able to acquire in their current circumstances. Their manes and horns are also a thing of interest, kinda sorta resembling the barbarian helm. Kinda, like a twisted version of it. Of course, none of this is a concrete proof that Lynels are indeed Zonai. Everyone is free to make their own judgment. However, all those little things definitely suggest that there is far more to Lynels than meets the eye, and the myriad of coincidences does paint a pretty interesting picture. And I like interesting pictures. As of right now, we have no idea what has happened to them, though upcoming Tears of the Kingdom might shed some light on this issue. When that comes out, I'll leave a pinned comment or something.